Among history's most remarkable figures, two men stand whose reigns shaped empires and witnessed the fall of monarchies: George III of Great Britain and Napoleon III of France. Each ruled during times of intense conflict and transformation, leaving behind legacies filled with ambition, tragedy, and change. Let us begin with the first, George III of Great Britain. George III was born on the 4th of June in the year 1738 at Norfolk House in St. James's Square, London. What shaped this prince born into royal expectation? How did a shy boy raised in a divided court become the longest reigning male monarch in British history? What early trials prepared him for the burden of empire? And what hidden struggles began in childhood that would one day threaten his rule? Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. George entered the world 2 months early, and his survival was uncertain. He was baptized the day he was born by Bishop Thomas Secker, and then formally presented to the world a month later. Though quiet and reserved, George was a quick learner. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died suddenly in 1751, making young George the new heir to the throne. As his mother Augusta shielded him from court politics and raised him in a controlled household, a new future began to unfold, one that would soon place a crown on his head far sooner than anyone imagined. As the young Prince of Wales grew into adolescence, his education became the cornerstone of his preparation for the throne. George III was the first British monarch to study science in a structured way. His lessons were broad and ambitious, designed to form not only a king but a gentleman of modern intellect. Living at Leicester Square with his mother and younger brother Edward, George was privately tutored. Among his instructors was Francis Ayscough, who later became Dean of Bristol. By the age of 8, George could read and write in both English and German. His studies included mathematics, Latin, French, history, astronomy, music, geography, and constitutional law, all woven together with a strong focus on Anglican faith. But it wasn't only knowledge that shaped him. His personality began to show shy in social settings, but inwardly firm in belief. He was taught strict moral discipline and carried a strong sense of duty, reinforced by his mother Augusta's deep religious convictions and insistence on decorum. At the age of 10, he acted in a family performance of Joseph Addison's play Cato, where he proudly recited, "A boy in England born, in England bred." This moment was more than dramatic flair. It was a message to the realm that the future king was truly one of their own. In these early years, George's path to monarchy was not just shaped by lessons and lineage, but by the clear image he would one day present to his people, a king devoted to Britain, by birth and by purpose. As George matured, royal responsibilities quickly overshadowed youthful dreams. By the time he turned 18, the court began searching for a suitable match, but George's heart had already wandered. He had fallen for Lady Sarah Lennox, a noblewoman of charm and beauty. Their connection was genuine, but the match was deemed unsuitable by his advisor, Lord Bute, and his mother, Augusta. George understood that personal happiness often clashed with royal expectations. "I am born for the happiness or misery of a great nation," he once wrote, "and consequently must often act contrary to my passions." With those words, he let go of Lady Sarah and turned toward a future chosen for him, not by love, but by duty. After careful deliberation, his mother arranged a proposal to Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a German duchess from a Protestant lineage. George approved the match. In September of 1761, just a year after becoming king, he met Charlotte for the first time on the day of their wedding. That same evening, they were married at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. Remarkably, George never took a mistress. Unlike his forebears and even his own sons, he was devoted to Charlotte. Their marriage was more than ceremonial. It was a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and affection. Theirs became a rare love story in royal history, not of stolen moments and scandal, but of quiet commitment in the public eye. Together, they would raise a dynasty that would define an age. On the 25th of October in the year 1760, George III ascended the throne following the sudden death of his grandfather, George II. At just 22 years old, he was the first monarch of the House of Hanover to be born and raised entirely in Britain, a fact he made central to his public image. His coronation took place less than a year later, on the 22nd of September, 1761, at Westminster Abbey. It was a grand affair filled with symbolism and ceremony, uniting the young king's personal devotion with his vision for the nation. During this event, George famously declared to Parliament, "Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain." That single line resonated across the kingdom, marking a shift from foreign dynastic influence toward a more distinctly British identity. Unlike many monarchs before him, George made no attempt to distance himself from the people. He appeared often in public and made deliberate efforts to be seen not just as a ruler, but as a moral figurehead. His reign began with widespread goodwill, as politicians from all sides of Parliament welcomed a young, native-born king who seemed to promise stability. Behind the celebrations, however, lay challenges already brewing, tensions within his court, shifting political alliances, and the fading triumphs of the 7 Years' War. Still, as Britain's new sovereign, George projected hope and resolve. In those early days, he embodied a nation proud of its heritage and hopeful for its future. The first years of George III's reign were anything but quiet. Though young and eager to rule, he inherited a realm strained by global warfare and political rivalries. The 7 Years' War, already underway since 1756, placed Great Britain in conflict across multiple continents, from Europe to North America, India, and the Caribbean. Politically, George faced immediate instability. His decision in May 1762 to replace the long-serving Whig government of the Duke of Newcastle with Lord Bute, a Tory and his mother's close advisor, sent shockwaves through Parliament. Bute's Scottish heritage and rumored closeness to Augusta made him a target of fierce criticism, particularly from Whig opponents who saw his rise as court favoritism. The press, led by figures like John Wilkes, turned public sentiment against the government. Satirical newspapers, such as the North Briton, accused Bute of corruption and incompetence. He resigned within a year, but the damage was done. George's choice of ministers would remain a controversial issue throughout his reign. Despite domestic political storms, the 7 Years' War ended on a high note. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 brought Britain tremendous gains, Canada from France, Florida from Spain, and key victories in India. It marked the height of British imperial power, yet also planted the seeds of unrest in the American colonies. For a young king, these early years were a trial by fire. Victory abroad brought glory, but at home, George now knew that every royal decision came under sharp and public scrutiny. With the 7 Years' War concluded, Britain found itself victorious but heavily in debt. To recover the cost of empire, Parliament turned its attention to the American colonies. The logic was simple. The colonies had benefited from British military protection and should help pay for it. But what seemed reasonable in London stirred fury across the Atlantic. In 1765, the Stamp Act was introduced by Prime Minister George Grenville. It placed a tax on all printed materials in the colonies, from newspapers to legal documents. For many colonists, it wasn't the money but the principle that outraged them. They had no representatives in Parliament, and they believed taxation without representation was an affront to their rights as Englishmen. The backlash was swift and organized. Protests erupted, pamphlets were printed in defiance, and colonial unity began to form. While the Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, new taxes, especially on tea, soon followed. The tension did not ease. Meanwhile, George III's government shifted from one ministry to another. He dismissed Grenville, tried to court William Pitt the Elder, and leaned on Lord Rockingham and then the Duke of Grafton. But none could bring lasting calm to either Parliament or the colonies. George believed deeply in royal authority, yet he also followed constitutional norms. He didn't invent the taxes, Parliament did, but he stood behind them. To many in America, however, the young monarch became the face of imperial injustice. A storm was brewing, and George stood firmly in its eye. By the early 1770s, the rift between Britain and its American colonies had widened into a near breaking point. The remaining tax on tea, left in place by Lord North's ministry, became a symbol of Parliament's stubborn control. When colonists in Boston boarded British ships and dumped tea into the harbor in 1773, it was no mere protest. It was a declaration of defiance. In response, Parliament enacted what the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed, and Massachusetts' charter was altered to limit self-rule. These harsh measures only galvanized colonial resistance further. Towns began organizing militias, and the call for unity spread throughout the 13 colonies. Throughout this period, George III was cautious. Contrary to later portrayals, he initially hoped for a peaceful resolution and largely followed the advice of his ministers. Still, as tensions escalated, he hardened his stance. In 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, he declared the American colonies in rebellion. The next year, the colonies made their boldest move. On the 4th of July in 1776, they issued the Declaration of Independence. Among the many grievances listed, George was accused of tyranny. He has abdicated government here, he has plundered our seas, destroyed the lives of our people. Statues of the king were toppled. His name became a rallying cry for revolution. Across the ocean, George faced a bitter truth. The colonies were no longer seeking reform. They were demanding freedom. As the American colonies declared their independence, George III faced one of the greatest crises of his reign. Though often painted as the villain of the American Revolution, he was not the architect of its harshest policies. He did, however, become the unwavering symbol of British resistance to colonial rebellion. George viewed the break from the colonies as a direct threat to British authority and honor. He supported Prime Minister Lord North's military efforts, even when victories were rare and costly. His speeches to Parliament emphasized duty, perseverance, and the dangers of disunity. To George, yielding to the rebels meant sacrificing the very principles of monarchy and governance. Yet, military fortunes were mixed. The British captured New York, but lost Boston. The campaign to divide the colonies from Canada failed at Saratoga in 1777, leading to France entering the war on the American side, followed by Spain and the Dutch. The war now spanned oceans and continents. Despite mounting losses, George resisted surrender. Even when Lord North offered to resign, the king persuaded him to stay. He believed the rebellion could still be crushed, or at least outlasted. In his view, rebellion must be punished and loyalty rewarded, but the war dragged on. When British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, the political foundation crumbled. Lord North resigned, and peace negotiations began. Though privately devastated, George did not abdicate. He accepted the loss with dignity, writing, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but I would be the first to welcome peace with the United States as an independent power." The end of the American War marked a turning point not just for the British Empire, but for George III personally. With the signing of the Treaties of Paris in 1782 and 1783, Britain officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. It was a moment of deep national loss and personal reckoning for the king. Though devastated, George showed surprising grace in defeat. When John Adams, the first American ambassador to Britain, met the monarch in 1785, George calmly said, "I was the last to consent to the separation, but the separation having become inevitable, I have always said, I would be the first to meet the friendship of the United States." At home, political power began to shift. The Whig Lord Rockingham briefly returned as Prime Minister but died shortly afterward. In the turbulent years that followed, George had to accept ministers he disliked, including the outspoken Charles James Fox. The king's influence in government wavered as new coalitions rose and fell. But George found a new ally in a young politician, William Pitt the Younger. Appointed Prime Minister in 1783, Pitt was only 24 years old. George admired his intelligence and moral outlook. With Pitt's rise, the king saw a renewed sense of order. Though the empire had contracted, George remained a constant figure of stability. In defeat, he had not collapsed. He had adapted. The king who had once refused to accept American independence was now learning to navigate a world reshaped by revolution, and one where kingship itself required evolution. Though George III ruled over global events, his personal life revealed a quieter side, one deeply rooted in family, faith, and virtue. Unlike many monarchs of his time, George was famously devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte. He never took a mistress, a rare commitment in royal courts. Together, they had 15 children, 9 sons, and 6 daughters, forming a large and close-knit royal household. In public, George presented himself as a moral father figure, not just to his children, but to the nation. He was often seen strolling through parks, visiting the seaside at Weymouth, or engaging directly with ordinary subjects. His frugal habits and modest tastes earned him the nickname Farmer George, originally meant to mock him, but later adopted with warmth and respect. He supported the Royal Academy of Arts, gave generously to charities, and built an impressive library that would later become the heart of the British Museum. George saw himself as a steward of national culture and values, not merely a ruler. Yet family life was not without strain. He demanded strict discipline from his children and was dismayed when his sons strayed from his moral expectations. His relationship with his eldest son, the future George IV, was especially troubled, marked by disobedience, excess, and political rivalry. Still, to much of Britain, George represented stability. In an age of revolutions and uncertainty, he stood as a symbol of decency and national identity, a king not just of crowns and armies, but of home and heart. In the late 1780s, whispers began to spread across court and country. Something was wrong with the king. George III, once admired for his calm dignity, began to display erratic behavior. In the summer of 1788, while visiting Cheltenham and later traveling through the countryside, his condition rapidly worsened. What followed was one of the most public and puzzling breakdowns in royal history. George spoke endlessly, often for hours at a time, and his letters stretched into hundreds of tangled words. He foamed at the mouth, repeated himself obsessively, and was sometimes incoherent. Rumors flew that he mistook trees for foreign kings or ranted in unknown tongues. While exaggerated, These stories fed growing unease. Physicians struggled to explain the cause. Some believed he suffered from evil humors. Others restrained him forcibly or applied harsh treatments in desperate attempts to calm him. Modern scholars would later debate whether his illness stemmed from porphyria, bipolar disorder, or something else entirely. The political consequences were immediate. Parliament was thrown into chaos, unsure who should govern. William Pitt and Charles Fox clashed over whether the Prince of Wales had the automatic right to act as regent. Just as a regency bill passed the Commons, something unexpected happened. George recovered. By early 1789, he returned to public life, welcomed with nationwide celebrations. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered in joy. For a moment, the king's mind was clear again, but this episode was only the beginning. Shadows had fallen, and they would return. As the king recovered from his mental collapse, a new storm was building across the Channel. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, shaking Europe's monarchies to their core. George III, deeply committed to order and tradition, watched with alarm as France overthrew its king, executed nobles, and unleashed waves of violence. By 1793, Britain was drawn into war against revolutionary France. George gave full support to Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, who raised taxes, strengthened the military, and suspended certain civil liberties to root out domestic radicals. In 1795, George's own carriage was attacked by bread rioters during a parliamentary opening, a rare personal brush with civil unrest. The first coalition against France faltered, and by the turn of the century, only Britain remained at war. In response to Irish uprisings and the threat of French invasion, Parliament passed the Acts of Union in 1800, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. George, proud of Protestant traditions, strongly opposed Catholic emancipation, believing it violated his coronation oath. When Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France and declared himself emperor, the threat became existential. Britain feared invasion, and George took it personally. At the height of fear in 1803, he reviewed tens of thousands of volunteers in Hyde Park and declared he would take up arms himself if the French landed. This was a monarch fully engaged, not merely signing treaties, but standing ready to defend his people. The shadow of revolution had reached his doorstep, and George met it with resilience and resolve. The dawn of the 19th century brought both union and division. In the wake of the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the British and Irish parliaments passed the Act of Union, effective from the 1st of January, 1800. This monumental act united the two kingdoms into a single entity, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with George III as its sovereign. But the union raised a difficult question. Should Roman Catholics be granted full political rights within the new kingdom? Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger believed it was necessary for long-term peace. George did not. He saw the idea as a direct violation of his coronation oath, which required him to uphold the Protestant faith. For him, it was not merely a policy debate, it was a sacred duty. The king's resistance placed him at odds with much of the government. Pitt threatened to resign unless the Catholic question was addressed. George stood firm. Pitt followed through and left office in 1801, replaced by Henry Addington. George's mental health, already fragile, took another downturn during this time. He blamed the strain of the Catholic debate for his relapse. Though he recovered again, this crisis marked a deepening divide between crown and cabinet. In the eyes of many, George was defending tradition and national identity. To others, he appeared stubborn and out of step with a changing world. Yet through all this, one thing remained constant. His faith guided his crown, and he would not compromise on what he saw as divine duty. By the end of the first decade of the 19th century, the long reign of George III began to slip into twilight. Though still beloved by many, his body and mind were failing. He suffered from cataracts that left him nearly blind, rheumatism that caused constant pain, and increasing signs of mental instability. The death of his youngest and favorite daughter, Princess Amelia, in 1810 was a devastating blow. Witnesses described scenes of heartbreaking grief, and the king himself fell into deep despair. That same year, he suffered a final and irreversible mental collapse. Parliament passed the Regency Act of 1811, officially transferring royal duties to his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, who would rule as Prince Regent. Though George III was still king in name, he would never again participate in government. Meanwhile, the kingdom he once led faced great external pressures. Britain remained locked in battle with Napoleon, and the nation needed strong leadership. Under the Prince Regent and Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, Britain eventually triumphed. The Napoleonic Wars ended with victory at Waterloo in 1815, but George never knew of it. In his final years, he lived in seclusion at Windsor Castle, completely blind, likely deaf, and suffering from dementia. He no longer recognized family members nor understood events unfolding around him. Yet within those darkened chambers, the monarchy endured. While the king faded from public life, the Regency marked a transition in Britain, from the age of paternal monarchy to the dawn of modern constitutional power. George's shadow loomed large, even as his light quietly dimmed. With his health in steep decline, George III lived his final years in near total isolation. By Christmas of 1819, he was nearly blind, deaf, and locked in constant confusion. He spoke nonsense for hours, unaware that his beloved wife, Queen Charlotte, had died the previous year, or that his kingdom had won a climactic victory at Waterloo. On the evening of the 29th of January, 1820, George III died at Windsor Castle at the age of 81. He was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel, ending a reign that had lasted nearly 60 years. George's legacy is complex and far-reaching. He was once vilified by American revolutionaries as a tyrant, yet he was also deeply respected in Britain for his personal integrity, faith, and unwavering commitment to duty. Though he lost the American colonies, he presided over the transformation of Britain into a modern, industrial power. His reign witnessed the birth of the United Kingdom, the abolition of the slave trade, and a global reshaping of empires. He lived through revolutions, wars, and the dawn of a new century, but above all, George remained a symbol of constancy in an era of great change. For historians, he offers a study in contrasts, both strong and vulnerable, decisive and troubled. As Britain moved toward parliamentary reform and industrial expansion, George III became a bridge between the past and the future. The last king to rule the old empire, and the first to witness the rise of the modern British nation. Even today, debates around his reign continue. Was he a rigid monarch clinging to lost power, or a devout sovereign who stood firm as the world shifted beneath his feet? In truth, he was both. His story is not just of a king, but of a man who tried to hold his country together, and in doing so, became its reluctant symbol of endurance. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 20th of April in the year 1808 in Paris, during the waning days of Napoleon Bonaparte's First Empire. How does the nephew of the great Napoleon rise from exile to claim an imperial crown of his own? What forces shaped the boy who bore the burden of a legendary name? And in a century filled with revolutions, failures, and shifting power, How did he come to redefine what it meant to be emperor? Charles Louis was just a toddler when the tides of power turned. His uncle, Napoleon I, had been exiled to St. Helena, and the Bonaparte family was cast out of France. His father, Louis Bonaparte, once King of Holland, chose a quiet life in exile, while his mother, Hortense de Beauharnais, Napoleon's stepdaughter, fiercely defended the family legacy. The young Louis Napoleon spent his formative years between Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. Raised in the shadows of empires and memory, he was tutored in both liberal and imperial ideals. While Europe reshaped itself after Napoleon's fall, he was quietly absorbing lessons in military science, philosophy, and the art of persuasion. He became fluent in multiple languages and cultivated a personal mythology rooted in destiny. France, meanwhile, was entering periods of turmoil, and in exile, a young Bonaparte watched, waited, and prepared. Though born into defeat, he carried the ambition of a dynasty. His time would come. Growing up under the watchful eye of his mother, Louis Napoleon developed a powerful connection to the memory of his uncle, Napoleon I. While other boys learned history, he lived it through stories of battles, glories, and betrayals that defined his family's rise and fall. These stories weren't distant tales, they were a call to action. His education was carefully curated to match his imperial inheritance. He studied mathematics, artillery science, languages, political theory, and the philosophies of Enlightenment thinkers. He read deeply from Machiavelli, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, forming ideas that mixed ambition with modern thought. In Switzerland, he received military training, honing a discipline that went far beyond mere theory. But what made Louis Napoleon unique was his belief in fate. He saw his life not just as a journey, but as a mission to restore the empire and redeem the Bonaparte name. In 1832, the death of the Duke of Reichstadt, Napoleon I's only legitimate son, made Louis Napoleon the new Bonapartist heir in the eyes of many loyalists. From that moment, he began crafting his public image, a man of the people with an imperial destiny. He wrote political pamphlets, argued for universal suffrage, and championed a vision of France where social reform could thrive under a strong hand. His identity was no longer just that of an exile's son. In his mind, he was the rightful heir, a future emperor in waiting. And history, he believed, would open its doors once more. By the early 1830s, Louis Napoleon's dreams of empire had taken on bold and dangerous form. No longer content with ideas alone, he attempted to force history's hand. In 1836, he led a small band of loyalists in Strasbourg in an ill-planned coup to seize control of the local garrison. His aim was to spark a national uprising, but it ended in embarrassment. He was arrested and swiftly exiled to the United States. Still undeterred, he returned to Europe and plotted again. In 1840, while France was commemorating the return of Napoleon I's remains to Paris, Louis Napoleon launched another insurrection, this time at Boulogne. Armed with a small group of followers, he hoped to ignite Bonapartist sentiment. But the plan collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers refused to defect, the crowd did not rally, and Louis was captured on the beach. This time he was not exiled, he was imprisoned. He was sentenced to life at the fortress of Ham, a grim and isolated place in northern France. Yet rather than break his spirit, the prison years strengthened his resolve. He wrote extensively, publishing works like The Extinction of Pauperism, blending social reform with imperial vision. Within the walls of Ham, Louis Napoleon turned failure into narrative. He presented himself not as a reckless adventurer, but as a misunderstood visionary. And behind bars, he waited not for pardon, but for opportunity. His exile had become captivity, but the dream of empire still burned brightly. In 1846, after 6 years of imprisonment at the fortress of Ham, Louis Napoleon made a dramatic escape disguised as a laborer. He fled France and made his way to England, where he would spend the next few years rebuilding his image and waiting for another chance. In London, he lived modestly but moved among political thinkers, aristocrats, and exiled revolutionaries from across Europe. This period became one of careful reinvention. Gone was the impulsive young conspirator. In his place stood a man who spoke of order, social progress, and national unity. He softened his tone, appealed to both conservatives and workers, and avoided radical speech. Through essays and pamphlets, he cultivated a message that combined the strength of empire with the promise of reform. He also worked diligently to maintain the Bonapartist flame. His writings, especially the idea of Napoleon and the people, presented a romantic vision of strong leadership rooted in popular support. He argued that democracy and authority were not enemies, that a single, enlightened ruler could embody the people's will better than a divided parliament. When the French Revolution of 1848 erupted and King Louis Philippe abdicated, the Second Republic was declared. France suddenly needed a president, and Louis Napoleon saw his moment. Though he had lived in exile, he was not forgotten. Bonapartist supporters rallied quickly, and the name Napoleon once again stirred hearts across the nation. The road back had been long and filled with failure, but it was now leading straight to power. In December of 1848, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was elected president of the French Second Republic by a landslide. With over 5 million votes, he defeated his rivals with the sheer power of his name, a name still wrapped in the mystique of past imperial glory. But while the title was democratic, Louis's vision went far beyond a 4-year presidency. He took office promising order, prosperity, and a unifying hand for a fractured nation. Yet beneath his calm exterior, he resented the limits placed on presidential power. The Constitution forbade re-election, and the National Assembly, dominated by conservatives and Republicans alike, stood firmly against any extension of his term. So Louis plotted in silence. On the 2nd of December, 1851, the anniversary of his uncle's coronation and the Battle of Austerlitz, he struck. In a carefully coordinated coup, he dissolved the assembly, declared a state of emergency, and had key opposition figures arrested. French troops patrolled the streets of Paris, and posters went up declaring the restoration of order. Public reaction was mixed, but largely calm. There were brief uprisings in some provinces, but they were swiftly crushed. Louis justified his actions as necessary to protect democracy from division and chaos. A national plebiscite soon followed, with over 7 million voting in favor of his rule. By the end of 1852, the presidency was gone. Louis Napoleon had crowned himself Emperor of the French as Napoleon III. The Republic had been replaced, not by force alone, but by calculated consent. As Emperor Napoleon III, Louis Napoleon envisioned more than a throne. He imagined a modern, prosperous France reborn under imperial guidance. From 1852 onward, his regime combined authoritarian control with sweeping reform. He ruled with firm authority, yet aimed to win the loyalty of the people through progress. One of his most lasting legacies was the transformation of Paris. Working with Baron Haussmann, he oversaw an ambitious redesign of the capital. Narrow, medieval streets were replaced by wide boulevards, grand parks, and improved sanitation systems. The new Paris was not just more beautiful, it was also easier to police, reducing the risk of uprisings. This urban renewal became a model for cities across Europe. Beyond the capital, Napoleon III invested in railways, industry, and banking. He encouraged economic modernization, and promoted trade through agreements like the Cobden Chevalier Treaty with Britain. Agricultural productivity rose, industrial output surged, and for a time, the French economy flourished. Social policy was also on his agenda. He legalized labor unions, promoted housing projects, and introduced limited worker protections. Though press freedoms were curbed and political opposition silenced early in his reign, the emperor positioned himself as a friend of the common man, a social monarch. Yet all this development came at a cost. Heavy borrowing funded much of the empire's growth, and beneath the shining boulevards, discontent simmered. Still, for many French citizens, these were years of visible progress. Napoleon III had made good on a central promise to bring order and advancement through imperial strength. As emperor, Napoleon III knew that a stable imperial image required more than public works and policies. It needed the elegance and symbolism of a royal family. In 1853, he married Eugénie de Montijo, a Spanish countess known for her beauty, intelligence, and strong Catholic faith. Their union was both romantic and strategic, intended to bolster the monarchy's appeal among conservatives and traditionalists. Empress Eugénie quickly became a central figure in the imperial court. She was stylish, cultured, and devoted to charity. Yet she was also politically aware and deeply involved in matters of religion and education. While Napoleon leaned toward modernism and secular reform, Eugénie held fast to Catholic values, often clashing with his advisors over policy directions. Despite these tensions, she supported his reign with loyalty and grace. In 1856, the imperial couple welcomed their only child, the Prince Imperial, Louis Napoleon. His birth was met with national celebration, as it ensured a future for the Bonaparte dynasty. Portraits of the family were widely distributed, and the imperial household projected an image of unity, sophistication, and strength. Through carefully staged events, elegant court ceremonies, and lavish architecture like the reconstruction of the Louvre, the emperor and empress crafted a modern monarchy. Napoleon III, once a political outcast, now stood at the center of Europe's social elite. But behind the splendor lay growing contradictions between tradition and innovation, personal values and political goals. The imperial family was admired, even adored, but their world rested on foundations more fragile than they seemed. While reshaping France at home, Napoleon III looked outward with equal ambition. He believed that a strong empire required global reach, and that France's greatness must be measured not just by its cities, but by its colonies. His foreign policy blended strategic calculation with a desire for national prestige, often with mixed results. In North Africa, French expansion in Algeria continued aggressively. Though begun under earlier regimes, Napoleon III intensified colonization efforts, encouraging settlers and expanding military control. He spoke publicly about a civilizing mission, yet native resistance remained strong, and violence continued for decades. In Southeast Asia, he authorized naval interventions in Vietnam, setting the stage for future French dominion over Indochina. These early efforts marked France's re-entry into global competition alongside Britain and other powers. But the most dramatic and disastrous venture came in Mexico. In 1861, Napoleon III sent French troops to support a conservative coup and install Austrian Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. He hoped to create a Latin Catholic empire aligned with French interests. At first, it seemed a bold success, but resistance grew, and American opposition, fresh from its own civil war, signaled trouble. By 1867, Maximilian was overthrown and executed. French forces withdrew, and the campaign ended in humiliation. What began as a vision of imperial glory had turned into a costly failure. Napoleon's colonial ambitions were grand, but their legacy was uneven. His reach exceeded his grasp, and these foreign entanglements would soon haunt him as tensions rose closer to home. By the late 1850s, Napoleon III sensed the shifting mood of his empire. The early years of his rule had been marked by firm control, censorship, police surveillance, and suppression of dissent. But as France modernized and society became more politically conscious, pressure grew for change. The emperor, ever adaptive, began a gradual liberalization of his regime. He eased press restrictions, allowed limited parliamentary debate, and permitted opposition candidates to run more freely in elections. The corps legislatif, once largely symbolic, gained more power to shape legislation. Though still tightly managed, public discourse expanded. Political satire returned, critical newspapers re-emerged, and voices once silenced began to find space in the national conversation. Napoleon III hoped this controlled liberalization would satisfy reformists without threatening his authority. He presented himself as a ruler who could evolve, one who understood that empire and liberty need not be enemies. In 1860, he introduced constitutional reforms that gave Parliament more oversight, and by 1869, new elections showed a rising liberal opposition. These changes were not simply strategic. They reflected Napoleon's belief that his legitimacy rested on popular support. His empire, he argued, was built not on aristocratic lineage, but on the will of the people, a concept he inherited from his uncle's revolutionary legacy. Yet, as reforms expanded, so too did criticism. By loosening control, Napoleon III opened the door to forces he could not fully contain. His empire was growing more democratic and more vulnerable to internal challenge. As the 1860s progressed, the empire Napoleon III had built began to fray at its edges. The liberal reforms he introduced to calm critics now gave rise to stronger and more organized opposition. Political factions, from republicans to legitimists, used newly regained press freedoms and public platforms to question the emperor's leadership and challenge the very foundation of his rule. Satirical newspapers mocked his policies. Cartoons portrayed him as indecisive, aging, and out of touch. Intellectuals debated the role of the emperor in a modernizing France, and student protests added fuel to the unrest. Urban workers, once hopeful about social reform, grew frustrated with stagnant wages and poor working conditions. Strikes became more frequent, and the glamour of the early empire gave way to dissatisfaction. Rural France, which had long been Napoleon's conservative stronghold, began to lose confidence as well. Economic growth had slowed, and food prices rose. Meanwhile, corruption scandals in the court and growing criticism of Empress Eugenie's influence further eroded public trust. Napoleon responded with a cautious balance, granting more freedoms while trying to maintain control. But he was increasingly isolated. His health declined, and his ability to command the loyalty of all factions weakened. The emperor had promised a system that combined order and liberty, strength and compassion. But by the end of the decade, that balance seemed more fragile than ever. Discontent was no longer hidden. It was in the streets, in the papers, and in the minds of the people, and it was growing louder each day. In the background of domestic unrest, a far more dangerous threat was taking shape: the rise of Prussia under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck. While Napoleon III navigated reforms and rebellion at home, Bismarck was unifying German states under Prussian dominance, with quiet ambition and sharp political skill. The new power growing on France's eastern border was not merely a concern, it was a challenge to the balance of Europe. Napoleon misjudged the pace and purpose of Bismarck's moves. He watched as Prussia defeated Denmark, then Austria, and began to forge a new German confederation. France remained officially neutral during these wars, hoping to gain influence afterward. But Bismarck gave Napoleon no rewards, no territory, and no role. France was sidelined and resentment grew. The breaking point came in 1870 over the candidacy of a Hohenzollern prince, a relative of the Prussian king, to the vacant Spanish throne. France feared encirclement and demanded the withdrawal of the candidacy. Though the prince withdrew, Bismarck edited a telegram from the Prussian king, the infamous Ems dispatch, to make it appear insulting. Napoleon took the bait. Feeling humiliated and pressured by hawkish advisors, he declared war on Prussia in July of 1870. It was a grave miscalculation. France was diplomatically isolated, militarily unprepared, and strategically disadvantaged. What began as a bold attempt to reassert French influence quickly spiraled into disaster. Napoleon believed he was defending national pride. Instead, he had walked into a trap carefully laid by his Prussian rival. In July of 1870, France declared war on Prussia, a decision made in haste, under pressure, and with dangerous overconfidence. Napoleon III believed a short, decisive campaign would restore his image and rally the nation behind the empire. But from the outset, the war exposed deep flaws in France's military, planning, and leadership. French forces were poorly organized, lacking unified command and modern logistics. Troops were scattered, communications were slow, and supply lines quickly broke down. In contrast, the Prussians, led by Helmuth von Moltke and backed by Bismarck's strategic diplomacy, moved swiftly and with precision. Within weeks, the tide had turned. French forces suffered major defeats at Wissembourg, Spicheren, and Worth. Panic spread through the ranks and morale plummeted. Napoleon himself took command and joined the army of Chalons, hoping to rally his men and reverse the setbacks. But his health was failing and his presence offered little advantage. By August, the French were in retreat. Attempts to regroup only led to further confusion. The Prussians surrounded key armies, cut off escape routes, and pressed toward deeper victories. Cities braced for siege, and political unrest bubbled back home in Paris. What was meant to be a patriotic defense of honor had become a disastrous campaign. The emperor had bet everything on a war he could not win. And as summer faded, France was not advancing toward glory, it was marching straight into collapse. The empire that once promised strength now faced its darkest hour. The fate of Napoleon III and his empire was sealed on the 1st of September 1870 at the Battle of Sedan. Encircled by Prussian forces and heavily outnumbered, the French army of Chalons found itself trapped in the small northern town near the Belgian border. The emperor, weakened by illness and commanding an army in disarray, could do little but watch as disaster unfolded. The battle was swift and brutal. French attempts to break free were crushed by superior Prussian artillery and tactics. Over 100,000 French troops were surrounded, thousands were killed or wounded, and tens of thousands more surrendered. Among them was Napoleon III himself. On the 2nd of September, he offered his sword and surrendered personally to King Wilhelm of Prussia. The news of the defeat shocked France. Within days, crowds in Paris took to the streets. The French Second Empire collapsed overnight, and the Third Republic was declared on the 4th of September. Napoleon had fallen not only as a general, but as a symbol of authority. He was taken into captivity and held in comfortable but humiliating confinement at Schloss Wilhelmshohe in Germany. The man who had once ruled Europe's most elegant court was now a prisoner of war. The fall of Sedan was more than a military loss, it was the end of an era. The dream of a Bonapartist empire, revived with such care, had collapsed in a single battle. And Napoleon III, once the embodiment of ambition, was now only a name from a broken past. After his surrender at Sedan, Napoleon III was held in dignified captivity in Germany. Though treated with courtesy, the loss of his crown and the collapse of his empire weighed heavily. In March of 1871, he was released and chose to settle in England, joining his wife Eugenie and their son, the Prince Imperial, at Camden Place in Chislehurst, Kent. There, the fallen emperor lived in quiet exile. The once powerful ruler now spent his days writing memoirs, receiving visitors, and nursing a mix of regret and reflection. He defended his decisions in print, especially his role in the Franco-Prussian War, arguing he had acted in defense of France's honor. Yet privately, he acknowledged misjudgments, particularly his failure to prepare France militarily. Despite his downfall, Napoleon III never stopped dreaming of a return. He believed that history could shift again, that the French people might one day call upon the Bonapartes in a time of need. He remained politically engaged through letters, reading European newspapers and advising fellow exiles. His health, however, steadily declined due to kidney stones and complications from surgery. What deepened his sorrow most was watching his son grow up far from the homeland they once ruled. He pinned his hopes on the young Prince Imperial as a future leader, the embodiment of a Bonapartist revival. Family, legacy, and destiny still filled his thoughts. Though stripped of a throne, Napoleon retained the habits of a ruler, dignity, protocol, and belief in fate. Even in exile, he clung to the notion that an emperor's mission was never truly over, only delayed by time and fortune. In early 1873, Napoleon III underwent a painful operation to remove kidney stones, a procedure that proved too much for his weakened body. On the 9th of January, he died at Camden Place in Chislehurst, far from the imperial palaces of France. He was 64 years old. His death marked the quiet end of the Second French Empire. There was no return to glory, no restoration of the Bonapartist dream. Empress Eugenie and their son, the Prince Imperial, were left to carry the weight of memory and legacy alone. His funeral in England was modest but respectful, attended by European dignitaries who remembered him as both a leader and a rival. In France, reactions were mixed. Some mourned, recalling his years of reform, growth, and national pride. Others remembered the censorship, the failures abroad, and the humiliation at Sedan. His complex legacy split public opinion. To some, he was a forward-thinking modernizer. To others, a monarch who gambled too much on war and pride. The Bonapartist movement lived on briefly through his son, but it never regained momentum. The Prince Imperial died in 1879 while fighting for the British in South Africa, ending the male Bonaparte line in tragedy. The dynasty had begun in fire and revolution. It ended quietly in exile and foreign soil. Yet Napoleon III remains a figure of historical fascination. Neither fully emperor nor republican, neither holy villain nor hero, he existed in the gray space of ambition, vision, and consequence. His life, like his reign, defies simple judgment. He left behind a modernized France, a reimagined Paris, and a legacy forever shadowed by both achievement and defeat. His reign was a study in contrasts, idealism blended with miscalculation, grandeur marred by loss. In the end, he stood as a man who dared to dream in a world that demanded results, and whose memory still lingers between progress and downfall. What do you think about King George III of Britain? Was George a steadfast and moral monarch, a man who loved his country, nurtured his family, and guided his kingdom through an age of revolution and change? Or was he a tragic ruler plagued by illness, misunderstood by history, and remembered more for madness than for monarchy? And what about Emperor Napoleon III of France? Was Napoleon III a visionary leader, a modernizer who reshaped Paris, expanded France's influence, and ruled with reform in mind? Or was he a fallen dreamer, overreaching in ambition, defeated in war, and left to die in exile far from the empire he built? Were these two rulers symbols of strength, each holding together their nations in the face of chaos? Or were they reflections of the fragile weight of power, men bound by legacy, who tried to shape history but were undone by its storms? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past, stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.